We often, we rely on the official stories, right,
Yeah.
to understand big policy changes,
Hmm.
especially the ones we get from mainstream media.
Hmm.
But what if those stories, those narratives, aren't just incomplete? What if they're actually misleading, particularly for the people who are most affected?
Right.
What if the map we're given to navigate all this change, well, what if it wasn't drawn for everyone? Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into a really powerful piece by Jaime Hoerricks, PhD. It's called What the Map Doesn't Show You. Legible to them, unlivable for us.
Yeah, it's a piece that really makes you stop and think about how information gets framed and who gets to do the framing.
Exactly.
And the core mission, really, of this deep dive into her work is to look closely at how these official stories, and yeah, the mainstream media, frame these big policy shifts.
Hmm.
She talks specifically about something she calls the One Big Beautiful Bill, which is actually a budget bill. And her point is that this framing, this beautiful bill idea, hides some pretty devastating real-world impacts.
Devastating impacts.
Yeah, we'll explore why she argues these official narratives often just gloss over the true cost, especially for disabled, autistic, and poor individuals. And we'll get into why she says, quite forcefully, that narrative is infrastructure.
That phrase really jumps out. Narrative is infrastructure. And what's also interesting, you mentioned her work. This piece isn't standalone, right? It's part of a series.
Exactly. This is actually the third piece she wrote tracking the damage from this particular bill. So it's more of a reflection, really, on how the story of these cuts gets told.
Okay.
Who tells it, what kind of turn they use, and maybe what their purpose is in telling it that way.
Right. She seems to be arguing that the map we get handed, it looks clean, maybe optimistic even.
But it was never drawn for us. That's her line. And it certainly wasn't drawn by us. It's really about revealing who gets made invisible, sort of beneath those neat lines on the official map.
So that series then, it must provide some crucial context for understanding why she feels the official map is so wrong.
Absolutely. She explored how this one big, beautiful bill, as she calls it, doesn't just, cut funding. She argues it severs lives, it collapses infrastructure, and it fundamentally redraws the map of survival.
Wow. Severs lives. That's strong language.
It is, and she contrasts that reality with how it's often presented, almost as if nothing fundamental has really changed, which definitely makes you wonder where else this might be happening.
Yeah, like what other beautiful bills are out there that are maybe changing lives in ways we just aren't hearing about?
Well, her analysis builds from two earlier pieces, like I said. The first was called Optional Until It's You.
Okay.
And that looked at how Medicaid cuts, often framed with words like flexibility, were actually gutting essential supports for autistic people.
Right. Flexibility sounds positive, but
Exactly. Then the second piece, No Roads Forward, kind of zoomed out. It looked at climate, mobility, and this feeling of being physically, economically, and infrastructurally trapped in what she calls an age of policy abandonment.
policy abandonment. Okay.
So, yeah, this third piece we're focusing on today really takes a step back to analyze the narrative itself. How the story is told becomes part of the policy's impact.
And a key part of that analysis is this comparison she makes, right, between her approach and outlets like Disability Scoop.
Yes, that's a really central contrast for her. She holds them up as an example of a certain kind of reporting.
How does she describe their framing?
Well, she characterizes their tone as familiar, measured, professional, the voice of institutional concern.
Institutional concern.
And she gives specific examples, like on housing cuts, she points to a headline. Housing advocates worry states can't fill rental aid gaps if Trump cuts go through.
Right. Focusing on the advocate's worry.
Exactly. Hoerricks points out it didn't say, people will lose their homes or communities will be set back. It frames it as a worry, an institutional problem, not a lived crisis.
I see. And there was another example.
Yes, on Medicaid cuts. The headline was, Congress approves nearly $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid-threatening disability services. And she says, look, that's not a lie, but not a truth either. Not the kind you can live inside.
Not the kind you can live inside.
Okay.
What does she mean by that?
She argues it makes this huge structural collapse sound like unfortunate budget maths. Just numbers, not lives.
Okay. So what's fascinating here is why she thinks they frame it this way. It's not necessarily malice, is it?
No, not necessarily. She suggests Disability Scoop reports on the disability sector, not from the disabled experience. Their audience, she argues, is largely lawmakers, administrators, service professionals.
Mm.
So their role becomes translating policy into these, quote, polite summaries. And in doing that, she says, it makes the information legible to systems, but, and this is her key point, in that effort, they make the rest of us disappear.
Wow. So the very act of making it legible for the system makes the human cost invisible.
That's her argument, that this kind of reporting, because of its audience and purpose, consistently lacks, well, urgency, grief, presence. You don't hear the disabled voice speaking from inside the high stakes.
Right. There's no mention of the actual fear, is there? Like losing your transport, not being able to get to work or the doctor, or just sort of vanishing in practice.
Precisely. And her counterpoint is just so stark. She says, concern is not analysis, and a summary of budget lines is not a roadmap for surviving what they set in motion.
That's powerful.
Yeah. She says, their stories make the map look navigable. Mine begin with the terrain, the missed bus, the shuttered clinic, the long walk home with the child melting down in the heat. It's just a completely different starting point.
A different map altogether based on lived reality, not policy summaries.
Exactly.
Which really underscores why she felt she had to write about this herself, from her own perspective. You know, when the official maps don't work, you need a different kind of guide.
That's it. The value of independent writing, like hers, comes right into focus here. She wasn't writing just to explain the news. She says she wrote because she was living inside it.
Living inside it. So she provides what she calls survival context.
Yes, that's the term she uses. And she contrasts it with what mainstream outlets often do. They might report, services might be impacted or housing would shift to block grants. Abstract language.
Vague.
Right. Hoerricks explains what that actually means. Not in the abstract, but in lives, in bodies, in the quiet disappearance of possibility.
Can you give an example of how she breaks that down?
Sure. She takes specific terms, like the word optional used in Medicaid policy.
Okay.
She argues it's not just a neutral descriptor, it's a legal category with potentially lethal consequences. It makes vital services like AAC, that's augmentative, and alternative communication.
Right, for non-speaking people.
Yes. And things like in-home support, mental health care, it makes them expendable by design.
Expendable by design, wow. So optional really means first on the chopping block.
That's the implication. Or take block grant logic. She unpacks that not just as a change in how money flows, but as a mechanism of abandonment.
How so?
Well, she argues it lets the federal government cut support while sort of pretending it hasn't really cut support, just given states flexibility. But it forces states into this terrible position of having to triage who survives.
Triage who survives. That's chilling.
It is. And the impacts she lists are concrete. Losing communication, housing, school access, essential care, community connection, and she even links these specific policy moves to bigger things like climate collapse, mobility erasure, and what she calls enclosure as policy.
It really broadens the scope. It's not just about budgets. It's about fundamental rights and structures.
Exactly. And she doesn't see this just as providing information. For her, it's about orientation.
Orientation. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
What does she mean by that?
It's like how we name the trap so others don't walk into it blind. It's giving people the tools to understand the real landscape they're navigating, not just the official sanitized version.
And why does she think these truths, the ones from the ground level, are so often missing from corporate media? Is it just oversight?
She argues it's deeper than that. She says corporate media doesn't tell these truths not because they're hidden, but because telling them would mean naming a system that's working exactly as designed.
So reporting the reality would expose the system itself.
That's her claim. So instead of striving for traditional objectivity, she offers clarity. And she argues that sometimes clarity is the more radical act.
Clarity as radical. I like that. Which brings us back to that really provocative statement. Narrative is infrastructure. I'm still wrestling with that. How can a story, a narrative, actually be infrastructure?
Right. It sounds abstract, but she argues it has very real material impacts. She says narrative shapes what gets built, what gets funded, who gets seen, and who gets left standing on the curb when the last bus quietly disappears.
So the story determines the physical reality.
In a way, yes. The dominant narratives, the official stories, create what she calls an illusion that the system is still navigable.
How does that illusion work?
Well, through language like services aren't gone, just under review or lives aren't unraveling, just potentially impacted. It maintains a facade, right? A sense that things are basically okay even when they're falling apart for the people actually relying on those services.
Okay, I'm starting to see it. The narrative props up the system, even when the system itself is failing people.
Exactly. And this is where she says lived experience writing becomes so crucial, it deliberately breaks that frame.
How does it break the frame?
By showing where the map curls at the edges, where the lines have already faded, where the bridge you're told to cross has long since collapsed. It points out the policy equivalents of red lines and these exclusion zones in budgets.
Exclusion zones?
Yeah, where vulnerable people end up always adjacent to help but never quite inside its reach. It forces you to ask, who was the system ever really designed to serve?
And she brings her own life into this, too.
Right.
To illustrate the point.
She does, very powerfully. She shares that she is autistic, chronically ill, and works full-time as a public school teacher. But despite having PhDs, her income, she says, barely lifts me from broke to very poor.
Which completely challenges that assumption, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That if you're employed, especially with qualifications, you must be stable and have access.
Absolutely shatters it. And she explains how the disappearance of services happens quietly. When federal funding gets cut, it's not some big headline event often.
No.
It's your local transit pass maybe not being available anymore, or the Medicaid-funded therapist having a year-long waiting list, or the public health clinic reducing hours.
The small cuts that add up.
Right. They don't come with headlines, she writes. They come with fewer hours, longer waits, and blank stares when you ask for help. And then she lays out what she calls the truth most mainstream reporting won't say. Based on past precedent, states will almost always protect themselves first. They'll prioritize balancing their budgets over preserving supports for everyday people.
That's a really stark assessment of priorities.
It is, and it circles back to her main point about narrative.
Right. If the only stories we hear are the ones designed for policymakers,
then the rest of us, she argues, will be expected to live inside a fiction. A fiction where the system works on paper, even when it's vanished in reality for us. That's the power narrative holds.
So in the end, what's the role she sees for her own writing, for these independent voices?
She sees her work as kind of like dispatches from the edge of the system, part journalism, but also part survival manual.
A survival manual.
Yeah, written for people who've been told they're optional, but who are, in her words, refusing to disappear quietly. She's clear she doesn't write for prestige or clicks. It's about witnessing and sharing for clarity.
And she shares it freely, doesn't she?
Yes, that's important too. She notes that the people who most need this kind of clarity are often the ones who can least afford to pay for it, which is another layer of access, isn't it?
Definitely. So what does this all mean for you listening right now? It's a lot to take in.
It is.
Hoerricks acknowledges that maybe there may be no roads left on the official map. That sounds bleak, but she doesn't leave it there, does she?
No, she offers this counter-vision. She suggests that we're drawing new maps. With each act of storytelling, each thread shared, each quiet refusal to keep waiting at a stop that never served us.
So the act of sharing these lived experiences is building the alternative.
That seems to be her point. This deep dive into her work, I think, really shows us that just knowing the official story is never enough. We have to actively seek out and maybe amplify the voices mapping survival sideways, through care, clarity, collective memory.
Because the official route might not be coming.
Right. As she puts it, the route isn't coming, but we're building it anyway. And that really leaves us with a question, doesn't it? What other official maps out there might be hiding the real terrain of our world? And, maybe more importantly, how can each of us contribute in our own ways to drawing the more honest ones?